Welcome to History with Herodotus, where we embark on a journey through the ages, unraveling the complexities of human experience and the boundless expressions of our collective creativity. Today, we delve into the fascinating world of the Beat Generation, a cultural phenomenon that would shake the foundations of American literature, art, and society in the mid-20th century. In the aftermath of World War II, as the United States basked in the glow of unprecedented prosperity and global dominance, a sense of disillusionment began to simmer beneath the surface. The war had left an indelible mark on the American psyche, and the rising tide of consumerism and conformity only served to heighten the feeling of disconnection among many young people. It was amidst this backdrop of social upheaval and spiritual longing that the Beat Generation would eventually emerge, a loose collective of writers, poets, and artists who sought to challenge the status quo and forge a new path. To understand the genesis of this movement, we must first turn our attention to the early 20th century, when the seeds of discontent were being sown. The Lost Generation, as it came to be known, comprised of expatriate writers like Ernest Hemingway, S. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein, who had fled to Europe in search of artistic freedom and intellectual stimulation. Their works, often characterized by a sense of disillusionment and moral ambiguity, would later influence the Beat's own literary endeavors. In the 1930s and 1940s, the United States witnessed a surge in interest in jazz music, particularly among African American communities in cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. This genre, with its improvisational spirit and emphasis on creative expression, would later become a defining feature of the Beat ethos. The likes of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Charlie Parker were pushing the boundaries of musical innovation, creating a sense of spontaneity and experimentation that would inspire the Beats' own approach to art. Meanwhile, in the rarefied world of academia, a young Allen Ginsberg was growing up in Newark, New Jersey, surrounded by the intellectual fervor of his family's leftist politics and the poetic traditions of Walt Whitman. His father, Louis Ginsberg, a published poet himself, encouraged Allen's early literary endeavors, instilling in him a love for the written word and a desire to challenge societal norms. As we move into the 1940s, we find ourselves at Columbia University, where a convergence of talented young minds would eventually give rise to the Beat Generation. It was here that Ginsberg met Jack Kerouac, a charismatic and restless young writer from Lowell, Massachusetts, who had recently returned from serving in the Merchant Marine. Their friendship, forged in the crucible of late-night conversations, shared readings, and spontaneous adventures, would become the nucleus around which the Beat movement would coalesce. The influence of William S. Burroughs, an older and more worldly figure, cannot be overstated. A scion of the wealthy Burroughs family, he had already developed a reputation as a brilliant, if troubled, young writer, with a fascination for the darker corners of human experience. His experimental approach to writing, which would later yield the cut-up technique, would have a profound impact on the Beats' own literary innovations. As the 1940s drew to a close, the nucleus of what would become the Beat Generation was taking shape. In 1947, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac embarked on a series of road trips, crisscrossing the country in a battered old car, fueled by a sense of adventure and a desire to escape the stifling conformity of post-war America. These journeys, which would later be immortalized in Kerouac's seminal novel, On the Road, were marked by spontaneous encounters with eccentric characters, impromptu poetry readings, and marathon sessions of jazz-inspired improvisation. In the summer of 1948, Ginsberg and Kerouac found themselves in Denver, Colorado, where they met a young writer named Neal Cassady, whose charismatic presence and unbridled energy would soon become a defining feature of the Beat scene. Cassady's arrival marked a turning point in the group's development, as his infectious enthusiasm and spontaneous creativity helped to galvanize their sense of purpose and direction. In 1950, William S. Burroughs published his first novel, Junkie, a semi-autobiographical account of his experiences as a heroin addict in the underworld of New York City. The book's stark, unflinching prose and its unapologetic portrayal of addiction and despair sent shockwaves through the literary establishment, paving the way for the Beats' own experimental approach to writing. The following year, Allen Ginsberg began work on his masterpiece, Howl, a sprawling, free verse epic that would become the defining poem of the Beat Generation. Written in a frenzy of creative intensity over several weeks in August 1951, Howl was a passionate cry against the conformity and materialism of modern America, a celebration of the beauty and diversity of human experience, and a testament to the power of poetry as a force for social change. On October 7, 1955, Ginsberg took to the stage at the Sixth Gallery in San Francisco, where he delivered an electrifying reading of Howl to a packed audience of artists, writers, and musicians. The event, which would later be hailed as the birthplace of the Beat Generation, was marked by a sense of excitement and anticipation, as if the very air was charged with the promise of revolution and transformation. As the evening wore on, Jack Kerouac, Philip Lamantia, Michael McClure, and Gary Snyder all took turns reading from their own work, creating a sense of communal energy and shared purpose that would define the Beat movement for years to come. The Sixth Gallery reading was more than just a literary event. It was a cultural watershed, a moment when the boundaries between art, music, and politics began to blur, and the possibilities of creative expression seemed limitless. In the aftermath of the Sixth Gallery reading, the Beat Generation began to coalesce into a recognizable movement with its own distinct style, ethos, and mythology. The Beat's emphasis on spontaneity, creativity, and nonconformity resonated with a generation of young people disillusioned with mainstream culture, and their influence soon spread far beyond the confines of San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood. As 1956 dawned, Jack Kerouac was working feverishly on the Road, pouring his experiences from the road trips with Ginsberg and Cassidy into a manuscript that would capture the essence of the Beat Generation. Meanwhile, William S. Burroughs was experimenting with the cut-up technique, slicing up fragments of text and reassembling them into strange, disjointed narratives that challenged the very notion of literary coherence. In the midst of this creative ferment, Neal Cassady was careening from one adventure to the next, leaving a trail of chaos and inspiration in his wake. His legendary exploits, which included a stint as a brakeman on the Southern Pacific Railroad and a series of doomed love affairs, would soon become the stuff of Beat legend, symbolizing the movement's emphasis on living life to the fullest, no matter the cost. As the Beat Generation continued to evolve and diversify, its influence began to spread to other cities and artistic communities. In New York's Greenwich Village, poets like Gregory Corso and Peter Orlovsky were forging their own brand of Beat style, while in Los Angeles, a young Charles Bukowski was beginning to develop his unique voice as a poet and novelist. As the Beat Generation continued to spread its influence across the country, it also began to face challenges and criticisms from both within and outside its ranks. By the early 1960s, some of its key figures had begun to move on to new projects and interests, while others struggled with personal demons and creative exhaustion. Despite these challenges, the Beat Generation's legacy continued to grow, with many of its writers and artists going on to produce some of their most important work in the decades that followed. One of the most significant later events in the history of the Beat Generation was the death of Jack Kerouac in 1969 at the age of just 47. Kerouac's passing marked a turning point for the movement, as many of its other key figures began to reassess their own lives in creative directions. For example, Allen Ginsberg became increasingly involved in politics and social activism, using his poetry and public platform to speak out against war, inequality, and environmental degradation. As he once said, "The only war that matters is the war against the imagination," a sentiment that reflected the Beat Generation's enduring commitment to creative freedom and nonconformity. Meanwhile, William S. Burroughs continued to push the boundaries of literary experimentation, producing novels like Nova Express and The Wild Boys that explored new forms of narrative and language. His work remained a powerful influence on generations of writers and artists, from punk rockers to cyberpunk novelists. As Burroughs himself once observed, "Language is a virus," a notion that reflected the Beat Generation's fascination with the power of words to shape reality and challenge social norms. As the years passed, the Beat Generation's legacy only continued to grow, with its influence visible in everything from the counterculture movements of the 1960s to the punk rock and hip-hop scenes of later decades. Today, the Beat Generation is remembered as a pivotal moment in American cultural history, a time when a group of visionary writers and artists came together to challenge mainstream values and create new forms of expression. As Gary Snyder once said, "The Beats were a doorway to the 60s, a statement that reflects the movement's role as a catalyst for social change and creative revolution." Despite its many achievements, the Beat generation was not without its flaws and contradictions. Many of its key figures struggled with addiction, mental health issues, and personal conflicts, while others faced criticism for their treatment of women and minorities. Nevertheless, the Beat generation remains an essential part of American cultural heritage, a testament to the power of creativity and nonconformity to challenge social norms and inspire new forms of artistic expression. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.